The Nevada desert stretched out like an ocean of sand around me as I drove up to the checkpoint. Heat waves rippled off the pavement, distorting the barbed wire fence that surrounded the military installation. A guard booth stood at the entrance, a lone figure inside barely visible through the glare on the windows. "Identification," the guard said, extending his hand as I rolled down my window. The blast of air conditioning from his booth was a cruel reminder of the hell I'd been baking in for the last 3 hours. I handed over my newly issued security badge. "Ethan Graves. I'm the new night patrol for Sublevel 7. The guard's expression changed subtly, a momentary tightening around the eyes, a slight downturn of his mouth. He handed my ID back without meeting my gaze. "Follow the access road to Building C. Commander Wilson is expecting you." The gate slid open, and I drove through, watching it close in my rearview mirror. Something about the finality of that metal barrier sliding shut sent a chill down my spine despite the desert heat. Building C turned out to be a nondescript concrete structure identical to the dozen others scattered across the base. No windows, one door, no identifying marks except the stenciled letter. I parked in the designated spot and grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat. After 8 years in the Army and 2 unsuccessful attempts at civilian life, this job felt like my last chance at stability. Commander Wilson was a tall man with steel gray hair cropped close to his scalp. His office was Spartan, a desk, 3 chairs, and walls bare except for a map of the installation that revealed nothing but the layout of the surface buildings. "Graves," he said, not offering his hand. "Your military record is impressive. Your civilian record less so." I didn't respond. We both knew I was here because my options were limited, and they needed someone with clearance who wouldn't ask questions. "Your duties are simple," Wilson continued, sliding a folder across the desk. "You'll patrol Sublevel 7 from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. following this exact route." He tapped a diagram showing a circular pathway through what appeared to be a long tunnel with numbered rooms along its length. "You will not deviate from this route. You will check in via radio every hour. You will report any unauthorized personnel immediately." "What exactly am I guarding down there, sir?" I asked. Wilson's face hardened. "You're not guarding anything, Graves. You're monitoring, making sure the tunnel remains secure. No doors should be open, no unusual sounds should be heard, and no one should be down there but you." He stood up, indicating our meeting was over. "One last thing, Graves. The integrity of the tunnel system is paramount. Some guards report disorientation during night shifts. Ignore it. Stay on your route. That's all." "Disorientation, sir." "Your shift starts in 2 hours. Jackson, the day patrol, will show you the ropes." Jackson turned out to be a wiry man in his 40s with perpetually bloodshot eyes and a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles. He walked me to a freight elevator at the back of Building C. "You ex-military?" he asked as we descended. "Army, 8 years. "That'll help. They like hiring military for this post. We follow orders, right?" His laugh held no humor. 7 years in the Marines made me perfect for walking in circles all night. The elevator ride took longer than I expected. The display above the door clicked through the sublevels. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 7. When the doors finally opened, the cold hit me first, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. We stepped into a curved tunnel with white walls, bright fluorescent lighting, and a polished concrete floor. The ceiling was low enough that I could touch it by stretching my arm fully upward. Every 50 feet or so, there was a numbered door on the inner wall of the curve. "Simple job," Jackson said, leading me along the tunnel. "Walk the circuit, check the doors, they should all be locked. Radio check-in every hour. 1 full circuit takes about 30 minutes, so you'll make 16 rounds per shift." "What's behind the doors?" I asked, noticing they had no handles, just keypads. "No idea, never been inside any of them. Don't have the codes, don't want them." Jackson tapped his temple. "You'll last longer here if you don't get curious." He showed me the patrol route, which followed the tunnel's curve in a complete circle. The sameness of the environment was disorienting. White walls, numbered doors, fluorescent lights repeating endlessly. My only landmark was a red line painted on the floor that I was to follow exactly. "Any other personnel down here during the night shift?" I asked. Jackson shook his head. "Just you, the tunnel, and the cameras." He pointed to small black domes recessed into the ceiling at regular intervals. "Command can see everything, but they rarely check unless there's an incident." "Has there ever been an incident?" Jackson's eyes darted away from mine. "Not on my shift." That night, I began my first patrol. The tunnel was eerily silent except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the sound of my boots on the concrete. I counted the doors as I passed. Room 101, 102, 103, all the way to 112, then back to 101 again as the tunnel completed its circle. Each door was identical, steel with a numbered plaque and a keypad lock. None had windows or any indication of what might be behind them. The first night passed uneventfully, so did the second and third. By the end of the first week, I had settled into the monotony of the job. Walk, check doors, radio in, repeat. The pay was good, and the work was easy, if mind-numbingly dull. It was on the 10th night that I first noticed something odd. I had just completed my third circuit of the shift when I checked my watch. The round had taken 35 minutes instead of the usual 30. I figured I must have walked slower without realizing it and picked up my pace. But the next circuit took 37 minutes. I prided myself on my timing. In the army, I could estimate a 5-kilometer march down to the minute. Something felt off. The tunnel seemed longer somehow. I found myself breathing harder as I walked, as though the distance had increased. When I radioed in for my hourly check, I mentioned it to command. Sublevel 7 patrol to command. Circuit times are increasing. Has there been some change to the tunnel layout? After a brief pause, a voice responded. Command to Sublevel 7, negative on layout changes, maintain patrol route. The next day I mentioned it to Jackson during our shift change. "Yeah, that happens sometimes," he said with a shrug. "Place plays tricks on your mind when you're down here alone all night. I've had shifts where I could swear the whole tunnel was tilting. But the physical distance. Don't overthink it, Graves. That's my advice." He tapped his temple again, a gesture I was beginning to find irritating. "The ones who look too close don't last." That night, I brought a chalk marker from the supply closet. At the start of my shift, I made a small mark on the floor at what I designated as my starting point, the spot where room 101 was located. Then I began my patrol. When I completed the circuit and returned to my mark, I froze. Room 101 was there as expected, but my chalk mark was not on the floor in front of it. It was approximately 15 feet further ahead. I looked up at the nearest camera, wondering if someone was watching, if this was some kind of test or mind game. The black dome stared back, impassive and silent. I made another mark and continued my patrol. By morning, the discrepancy had grown to nearly 40 feet. The tunnel had somehow expanded during my shift, stretching like elastic without any visible sign of change. The walls looked the same, the doors were in the same sequence, but the total distance was undeniably longer. Worse, I had discovered something that shouldn't exist, a junction where the tunnel split into a Y shape before reconnecting further ahead. This junction wasn't on my map, it wasn't on any map, but there it was, a branching pathway that had appeared seemingly overnight. When I reported it to Commander Wilson the next morning, his face remained impassive. "There is no junction in Sublevel 7, Graves. Check your map again." "Sir, I saw it with my own eyes. The tunnel splits in. The tunnel," Wilson interrupted, "is a perfect circle with 12 rooms. There are no branches, no splits, no junctions. Is that clear?" "But is that clear, Graves?" His voice had lowered to a dangerous whisper. "Yes, sir." "Good. I suggest you get some rest. Night shifts can be disorienting." That evening, I arrived early for my shift, determined to document the junction before reporting for duty. But when I reached the spot where the split had been, there was nothing, just the continuing curve of the main tunnel. I began to doubt myself. Maybe Jackson was right. Maybe the monotony and isolation were getting to me. Then I saw it. Room 113. It was between 112 and 101 in a spot where I was certain no door had been before. Unlike the others, this door had a small window at eye level, a square of reinforced glass about 6 inches across. I approached cautiously, heart pounding. Through the window, I could see a small room with blank white walls. In the center sat a single metal chair. Above it, a fluorescent light flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. When I radioed command about room 113, Commander Wilson himself responded, his voice tight with unexpected emotion. "That room doesn't exist, Graves. Stay on your route." "Sir, I'm looking at it right now. It's between 112 and 101. It has a window." "None of the rooms have windows, Graves." Now there was no mistaking the tension in his voice. "Return to your patrol route immediately. That's an order." I stepped back from the door, but not before noting that unlike the others, room 113 had a conventional lock beneath its keypad, an actual keyhole. Over the next few weeks, the anomalies increased in frequency and intensity. The tunnel didn't just seem longer, it felt different. The walls, once solid concrete, now seemed to have a subtle give to them, as if they were made of something more flexible. When I placed my palm against the surface, I could feel a faint vibration, a rhythmic pulse like something breathing beneath the paint and concrete. The air changed too. It took on a metallic taste that coated my tongue and teeth. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing cold in some sections, uncomfortably warm in others. Sometimes I found moisture on the walls, droplets of what looked like water but felt warm and slightly viscous to the touch. Then there were the sounds. At first, it was so subtle I thought I was imagining it, a soft murmur just at the edge of hearing. Over time, it grew more distinct, a wet, sliding sound like something large dragging itself through mud. It always seemed to come from just around the curve ahead of me, but no matter how quickly I moved, I never caught sight of its source. My radio became unreliable. Static burst through at random intervals, and beneath the white noise, I began to hear voices, fragments of conversations, words cut off mid-sentence. Most disturbing of all, I sometimes heard my own name whispered through the static, drawn out and distorted. Ethan. Command denied receiving any unusual transmissions. According to them, my radio was functioning normally. They suggested I might be picking up interference from equipment elsewhere in the base. I knew better. The voices were coming from inside the tunnel. One night, a child's laugh echoed through my radio, high and delighted, cutting off abruptly into silence. I nearly dropped the device in shock. There were no children on the base, let alone in a classified underground tunnel. When I asked Jackson if he had experienced anything similar, he avoided my eyes. "Look, Graves, this job pays well for a reason. My advice, don't report the weird stuff, just do your patrol and collect your check." "But the tunnel is changing," I insisted. "New rooms appearing, the layout shifting." "Drop it," Jackson hissed, glancing nervously at the nearest camera, "for your own good." The next night the tunnel had transformed dramatically. New corridors branched off from the main circuit, some barely wide enough to squeeze through, others cavernously large with ceilings that disappeared into darkness. The lighting had changed too. Some sections were dimmer, bathed in an amber glow, while others were blindingly bright, the fluorescence humming at a higher pitch than normal. I discovered maintenance tunnels that weren't on any blueprint, narrow passageways with pipes running along the walls and ceiling. At various junction points, strange symbols were etched into the concrete, circular patterns with lines radiating outward like stylized suns. Despite Commander Wilson's orders, I began to explore these new pathways, marking my route with chalk to ensure I could find my way back. Each night the layout was different. Corridors that had been there the previous shift would be gone, replaced by new ones. Only room 113 remained constant, always appearing in the same spot between 112 and 101. Then I found the footprints. They appeared one night in a section of the tunnel where a fine layer of dust had settled on the floor. Boot prints, military issue, the same pattern as my own, but the stride length was wrong, slightly longer than mine, as if someone taller had made them. I followed the tracks, my flashlight beam bouncing off the white walls. They led to a section of the tunnel I had never seen before, then abruptly stopped at a solid wall. It was as if whoever or whatever had made them had walked straight through the concrete. When I checked the security footage the next day, claiming I needed to review my route, the monitor showed only me walking alone through the tunnel. No other figures, no mysterious footprints, just me patrolling in endless circles. 3 weeks into my employment, I arrived for my shift to find Jackson's post empty. His logbook lay open on the desk, the last entry incomplete mid-sentence. His coffee cup was still half full, the liquid inside cold. Jackson called in sick. The officer on duty told me when I asked. Commander said to start your shift as normal. But Jackson's car was still in the parking lot. I had parked next to it. That night, the tunnel felt different from the moment I stepped out of the elevator. The air was heavy, charged with static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. The fluorescent lights flickered more than usual, creating a strobe effect that left moving shadows in my peripheral vision. I began my patrol, radio in hand, senses on high alert. As I approached the section where room 113 always appeared, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door to room 113 stood open. In all my weeks of patrolling, I had never seen any of the doors open. They were always locked, their contents a mystery. Now, room 113 gaped like an open mouth, spilling harsh white light into the corridor. I knew I should radio command. I knew I should continue my patrol and report the security breach. Instead, I approached the open door, drawn by a curiosity that overrode my training and common sense. The room beyond was exactly as I had glimpsed through the window. Small, white, empty except for a metal chair in the center. The flickering light overhead cast jumping shadows across the floor. But there was something new. A small recording device sat on the seat of the chair, its red light blinking steadily. I stepped into the room, my boots echoing on the hard floor. The recording device was military grade, the kind used for mission debriefs. A small label on its side read, "Property of us armed forces." My finger hovered over the play button. Every instinct told me to walk away, to continue my patrol and pretend I had never seen this room. But I pressed play. My own voice filled the room. I shouldn't have gone off the route. It knows I'm here now. The recording fell silent for a moment, then continued with a series of wet, scraping sounds, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, a rasping breath too close to the microphone, then a sound that made my blood freeze, the crunch of breaking bone, followed by a gurgling scream that cut off abruptly. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the device. When I turned to flee, I found myself facing a smooth, white wall. The door was gone. Panic surged through me. I spun around, searching for an exit, but the room had changed. The walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering inch by inch. The light overhead flickered wildly, plunging the shrinking space into momentary darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. A seam appeared in the wall opposite me, widening into a doorway that hadn't been there before. Beyond it stretched a corridor I had never seen, narrow, dimly lit, curving away into shadow. At the far end of this new hallway, barely visible in the gloom, stood a figure. It was tall, roughly my height and build. As I watched, it took a step forward into a pool of light, and I gasped. The figure had my face. Not exactly my face, there was something wrong with it, something off. The proportions were slightly askew, as if someone had tried to sculpt me from memory and missed subtle details. But it was recognizably me, from my dark hair to the scar on my chin from a childhood accident. Its movements were wrong too, jerky and disjointed, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. It cocked its head at an impossible angle, regarding me with eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. When it spoke, its voice was a horrifying chorus, my own voice layered with others, some deep and growling, others high and keening. "Ethan Graves," it said, my name stretching and distorting in its mouth. "At last, we meet face to face." "What are you?" I managed to ask, my own voice barely a whisper. "I am you," it replied, taking another awkward step forward. "Or rather, I will be you. I've been studying you, you see, learning your mannerisms, your speech patterns, your memories. The process is nearly complete." "Where's Jackson?" I demanded, remembering my missing colleague. The thing wearing my face stretched its lips into an approximation of a smile. Jackson served his purpose, as did the others before him, as will you. Others? This facility has employed night patrols for decades, Ethan. Did you think you were the first? They come and go so quickly, replaced when they become problematic. Cold dread washed over me as I realized what it was implying. You've been replacing the guards. Not just the guards. Its smile widened impossibly, stretching beyond the confines of a human face. Why do you think Commander Wilson was so insistent that you never deviate from your route? Why do you think he dismissed your reports of changes in the tunnel? He knows what happens here. They all do. I backed away, but the thing matched my movements, maintaining the distance between us. Don't be afraid, Ethan. The transition is nearly painless, and afterward, you won't remember being replaced. You'll simply continue, a perfect replica with all your memories intact. The only difference will be your allegiance. My back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to run. The creature advanced, its movements becoming smoother, more natural with each step, more like me. Something inside me snapped. I lunged to the side, ducking under its outstretched arm and sprinting back toward the main tunnel. Behind me, I heard a sound like tearing fabric, followed by the wet slap of something heavy moving at speed. The tunnel ahead of me began to change, walls shifting to block my path. Doorways appeared and disappeared, corridors stretched or contracted. It was as if the entire sublevel was rearranging itself to trap me. I activated my radio, shouting for help as I ran. Command, this is Graves. There's something down here. It's changing the tunnels. The radio crackled and Jackson's voice came through, calm and measured. Too late, Ethan. It's already begun. I rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. Ahead of me, every door along the corridor stood open. Light spilled out from each room, illuminating scenes of horror within. Room 105 contained what appeared to be dissection tables, their surfaces stained dark. Strapped to one was a body, or what remained of one. It had been flayed, its skin removed with surgical precision, revealing red muscle and white bone beneath. Room 108 was filled with tanks of cloudy liquid. Floating within each was a human face, eyes closed, expressions peaceful, as if sleeping. I recognized one as a guard who had been fired months before I was hired. Room 112 held nothing but hundreds of photographs covering every inch of wall space. They were all of me, eating in the cafeteria, driving to work, sleeping in my apartment. Some were recent, taken since I started this job. Others appeared to be from years ago, long before I ever heard of this facility. I pushed on, trying to remember the layout of the original tunnel, hoping to find my way back to the elevator, but nothing was familiar anymore. The sublevel had become a labyrinth of twisting corridors and shifting rooms. I turned another corner and found myself in a large, circular chamber I had never seen before. It looked like a research laboratory. Computers lined the walls, complex equipment filled the center of the room, and illuminated displays showed what appeared to be medical data. On a desk near the door lay a folder marked Project Doppel, classified. I grabbed it and quickly flipped through its contents. The documents inside detailed research into what was called dimensional membrane instability, a weakening of the barrier between our reality and something else. According to the reports, the facility had been built around a breach point where the membrane was thinnest. The entities demonstrate remarkable adaptive capabilities, one report read. They can assume the form and memories of human subjects with increasing accuracy. Early specimens could only maintain the facade for short periods, but recent iterations have achieved near-perfect replication. Another document detailed containment protocols. Subjects, patrols, are to maintain regular routes to monitor entity activity without provoking aggression. Any deviation from established patterns may trigger accelerated replication attempts. A final page, marked with a red stamp reading, Commander's Eyes Only, stated bluntly, personnel are expendable, the breach must be studied, each replacement provides valuable data on entity evolution. I stared at the words, anger boiling through my fear. They knew. They had always known. Guards like me were never security, we were bait. A series of video files was open on one of the computers. I clicked play and watched footage of previous guards on patrol. In one clip, a young man walked alone through the tunnel, then suddenly stopped and looked over his shoulder. A shadow detached itself from the wall behind him, enveloping him in darkness. When the shadow receded, the guard continued his patrol as if nothing had happened, but his movements were different, slightly off. I heard the elevator hum to life in the distance. Abandoning the documents, I ran toward the sound, hope surging that I might escape this nightmare. I rounded the final corner and saw the elevator doors sliding open. Commander Wilson stood inside, his expression grim but unsurprised. "Graves," he said, stepping out to meet me. "I should have known you'd be trouble. Too curious for your own good." "You knew," I accused, backing away from him. "You knew what was down here all along. You've been feeding it guards for years." Wilson sighed. "It's more complicated than that, Graves. What's down here? What's coming through? It can't be stopped. We tried containing it, failed. We tried destroying it, failed again. The only option left was cooperation." "Cooperation? You're letting these things replace people." "They were going to do it anyway," Wilson said, his voice hardening. "This way, we have some control over the process. We can study them, learn from them, maybe even guide them." "Guide them to what?" "A more orderly transition." Wilson straightened his uniform. "They're coming through, Graves. The only question is whether the change happens chaotically or with structure. I chose structure." The elevator behind Wilson began to descend instead of ascend, its indicator showing lower levels I hadn't known existed. "What's down there?" I asked, nodding toward the descending elevator. "Sublevel 13, Wilson replied. "The core, where it all began." As if on cue, the elevator returned, doors sliding open to reveal a dark interior. Wilson stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "See for yourself." Every instinct told me to run, but where would I go? The tunnels were a maze, and something wearing my face was hunting me through them. Perhaps answers lay below. I stepped into the elevator. Wilson followed, inserting a key into a special slot on the control panel. The doors closed, and we began to descend. When the doors opened again, we were in a massive cavern that dwarfed anything I had seen before. The ceiling arched hundreds of feet overhead, lost in shadow. The walls were rough stone, unlike the finished concrete of the upper levels. In the center of the cavern floor was what I can only describe as a wound in reality, a pulsing, organic-looking structure embedded in the rock. It was roughly circular, about 30 feet across, and seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in a slow rhythm. Its surface rippled like water, but with colors that hurt my eyes to look at directly. "What is that thing?" I whispered. "We don't know exactly," Wilson admitted. "It appeared 50 years ago during a nuclear test. At first, it was just a small anomaly, a spot where radiation readings were off the charts. Then it grew, started changing. The facility was built to contain and study it." As we watched, a tendril of something not quite solid extended from the pulsing mass, reaching toward us before retreating. "It's alive. In a sense, but not alive like anything on Earth. It exists partially in our dimension and partially elsewhere. The entities come from the other side." A figure stepped out from behind a bank of monitoring equipment, my doppelganger, its movements now almost indistinguishable from human. It nodded to Wilson as if they were old colleagues. "You've been working with them," I realized, disgust rising in my throat. "Working with the inevitable," Wilson corrected. "The breach is expanding, Graves. In another decade, it will encompass the entire base. In 50 years, maybe the whole Southwest. We can't stop it, but we can shape how it happens." The doppelganger smiled my smile. "Your commander is very practical, Ethan. He understands adaptation, evolution. The strong survive by changing with their environment." I looked between them, pieces falling into place. "How long have you been replaced, Commander?" Wilson's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. 14 years. I barely remember being human now. It's better this way. Better to be a puppet for these things. Better to be part of what's coming than to be consumed by it, Wilson said. "You have the same choice, Graves. Join us willingly and your transition will be painless. Fight, and it will be..." less pleasant. My mind raced. There had to be a way out. The research I had found mentioned attempts to destroy the breach. They had failed, but that didn't mean destruction was impossible. What would happen if this facility was destroyed? I asked, stalling for time. If the breach was buried under tons of rock? It's been tried, the doppelganger said dismissively. The breach adapts, moves if necessary. It cannot be destroyed by conventional means. But Wilson's reaction told a different story, a slight tensing, a glance toward a control panel near the elevator. What about unconventional means? I pressed. The cavern trembled slightly, dust falling from the ceiling. The pulsing mass at the center responded, its rhythm accelerating. Time to choose graves, Wilson said, taking a step toward me, with us or against us. I lunged for the control panel, slamming my fist down on a large red button marked Emergency Purge. Alarms immediately began to blare throughout the cavern. Fool, Wilson shouted over the noise. You'll kill us all. Better dead than whatever you've become, I spat back. The doppelganger moved with inhuman speed, grabbing my arm and twisting. I heard bones snap, pain lancing up to my shoulder, but adrenaline kept me fighting. I slammed my head forward, connecting with its face. It stumbled back, momentarily confused by the pain, a very human reaction from something pretending to be human. Wilson was at the control panel, trying to override the emergency sequence. I tackled him, sending us both crashing to the ground. We grappled as the facility began to shake around us, concrete dust raining from above. Self-destruct sequence initiated. An automated voice announced calmly over the alarms. All personnel evacuate immediately. Detonation in 10 minutes. I broke free from Wilson and ran for the elevator, the doppelganger in pursuit. As the doors began to close, I caught a final glimpse of the cavern. The pulsing mass at its center was writhing now, tendrils whipping through the air as if in pain or rage. The elevator rocketed upward, the digital display counting the levels as I passed them. 13, 12, 11. The car shuddered violently as explosions began below, the self-destruct sequence targeting the lower levels first. At sublevel 7, the doors opened onto chaos. The tunnel system was disintegrating, walls cracking and floor buckling. Worse, the concrete itself seemed to be coming alive, rippling and flowing like liquid, reaching out with pseudopods that grabbed at my legs as I ran. I followed the emergency lighting toward what I hoped was an exit route, the tunnel collapsing behind me. Doorways that had once led to mysterious rooms now opened onto strange, impossible landscapes. Alien vistas under purple skies, oceans of something that wasn't water, cities built from materials that hurt my eyes to look at. The boundary between dimensions was breaking down completely. 5 minutes to detonation, the calm voice announced as I reached a stairwell. The elevator was too risky now. If it stopped between floors, I'd be trapped. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my broken arm held tight against my chest. Behind me, I heard something large moving up the stairwell. Not footsteps, but a wet, sliding sound. I didn't look back. Sublevel 3, Sublevel 2, Sublevel 1. The ground shook continuously now, the concrete cracking and reforming around me in unnatural patterns. The air itself felt wrong, thicker, with colors swirling through it that shouldn't exist. Finally, I burst through a fire exit into the desert night. The air was cool and clean, the stars hard points of light in the black sky. I ran as far from the facility as my legs would carry me before collapsing behind a large rock formation. From this vantage point, I watched as military vehicles swarmed the base, personnel evacuating in orderly lines. A black helicopter landed on the parade ground, and figures in unusual protective gear emerged, full body suits that reminded me of deep-sea diving equipment. I was too far away to hear what they were saying, but I could read the panic in their movements. One pointed toward the center of the base, where the ground was visibly subsiding, creating a vast sinkhole that swallowed buildings whole. Containment has failed, I read on his lips. Protocol Omega is active. The helicopter took off again, banking sharply away from the base. The remaining vehicles followed, a convoy of light streaming into the desert. No one was staying to fight whatever was coming up from below. As I turned to make my own escape, I caught sight of my reflection in the window of my car. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed wrong somehow. My face, but not my face. Then it was gone, just a trick of the light. I drove away from the base as the ground continued to collapse behind me. In my rearview mirror, I watched the facility disappear into the earth, taking its secrets with it. Or so I hoped. 3 months later, I was working security at a corporate research facility in Colorado. The pay wasn't as good, but the work was normal. No mysterious tunnels, no shifting architecture, no doppelgangers, just regular patrols and ID checks. At night though, I still dreamed of Sublevel 7. In my dreams, I was walking the endless corridor again, passing doors that opened onto nightmares. Sometimes I was chasing myself, sometimes I was being chased. I always woke up checking my reflection, making sure it was still me looking back. The news had reports of strange phenomena spreading outward from Nevada, unusual weather patterns, electronic equipment malfunctioning, people going missing only to return days later with no memory of their absence. The government blamed it on solar flares and mass hysteria. I knew better. One night, working late, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The hallway to the server room seemed longer than I remembered. When I measured it against my stride, it had stretched by nearly 10 feet since the beginning of my shift. The next night, I found a door that hadn't been there before, a plain steel door with a small plaque bearing the number 113. I didn't need to open it to know what I'd find inside. A metal chair, a flickering light, and a recording of my own voice warning me about what happens when you go off the designated route. Whatever had been beneath that base in Nevada hadn't been destroyed. It had spread, and part of it, the part that had studied me, copied me, had followed me here. As I write this, I can hear something moving in the corridor outside my security office. Not footsteps, something sliding wetly across the floor. The doorknob is turning slowly. And in the reflection on my computer screen, my shadow doesn't match my movements.